Hi, welcome to my EDL 853 Module 7 presentation, People First Language. My name is Jared Wilson. What is People First Language? People First Language is adapting proper terminology when speaking about individuals with disabilities, how to refer to individuals, and how to take an appropriate and respectful approach to proper nouns, proper pronouns to help make a more inclusive and supportive culture. Some quotes that kind of highlight what People First Language is. First one is people with disabilities are people first. So a lot of the terminology and things that we are focusing on are identifying that they are people and not that they are disabilities, and that they are just people prior to that before any type of conversation about a disability occurs. Another quote is, for far too long, people who happen to have conditions that we call disabilities have been subjected to devaluation, marginalization, prejudice, and more. The second is that language is not political correctness. Instead, it demonstrates good manners, respect, and the golden rule. And more, it can change the way we see a person. People First Language is the best place to start when talking to a person with disability, and identify an individual by name, then strengths, rather than labeling disabilities. It's this change in verbiage and usage of terminology that might draw attention to a disability rather than just to a person. Often we've seen in history where individuals are categorized by their disability, or that is how they're introduced, is by their disability, rather than just introducing them as people first. Some examples of how we can use people first terminology. So instead of saying the handicapped or the disabled, we could say things like people with disabilities. Instead of using things like he's mentally retarded, we can use words like Paul has a cognitive disability. Same thing goes for the next example. Rather than referring to a student as she's autistic, we can refer to a student as Kate has autism, or a diagnosis of autism. It continues on with the major focus being that you are not describing a person as a diagnosis. You are not saying that is a Down syndrome student. It would be that this is a student who does have a diagnosis of Down syndrome. There's a list to continue on that you can go through and look at and possibly use for future instances. So why would we focus on this change? Why would we do this? So it focuses on that the disability diagnoses are unfortunately often used to define a person's value and potential, to lower expectations, and a dismal future are the predicted norm. So being able to use that disability as a way to describe people almost enables further notions of what that person is able to do, what they are able to complete. It provides inaccurate descriptors. So you might describe a person inaccurately just by tagging a disability or a diagnosis on that individual. And then when should we do it? In communicating with or about people with disability. And to remember that they may have only one disability, but they have many abilities. Focusing on the positive things rather than the negative things. How can we do this? We can emphasize on abilities and not limitations. We do not use language that suggests a lack of something. We emphasize the need for accessibility, not the disability. And we do not use offensive language. This creates bad habits. And avoid language that implies negative stereotypes. For example, using the term normal people. As to where they might not realize that referring to normal people is actually identifying another group of individuals as not normal. And then last is to not betray people with disabilities as inspirational only because of their disability. So from the past, we might see that we have referred to individuals as handicapped. We've seen these in schools before. I particularly think about it whenever they talk about parking spaces. So handicapped. Instead of doing that, we say individuals with disabilities. Rather than going with mentally ill, We can look at mental health conditions, mental health diagnosis, things of that nature. Rather than referring to as special education, we can say that individual who receives additional services, additional school services, things like that. Rather than referring to a student that is wheelchair bound or maybe prosthetics bound or crutches bound, we say things like they use a wheelchair. I've heard statements such as they have crutches for access, things like that, rather than saying they are bound to something. And then handicap parking, now referred to as accessible parking. Thank you for referring to my presentation. Here is a list of references. Again, the ultimate goal of this presentation is just to begin identifying individuals as people rather than their disability, and how to use the proper terminology to refer to individuals so that we can include the most inclusive and appropriate supportive environment in our schools and in our communities. Thank you.